Welcome to Cybersecurity and Transformation, part of the Bridging the Cyber Divide podcast series. We're running this in partnership between innovationoz.com and CyberArk. My name's James Riley, editor of innovationoz.com. In this final episode of the series, we broaden our focus to Australia's really hunger to accelerate its digital transformation journey, sparked by the arrival, of COVID-19. And the imminent arrival, more broadly, of 5G. We'll be looking also at the health of the cybersecurity ecosystem. Cybersecurity and the ecosystem that supports it. Joining us today, we have Aleister McGibbon, who's the Chief Strategy Officer at CyberCX. He's a most recently former Deputy Secretary and National Cybersecurity Advisor at the Department of Home Affairs in Australia. He was also Deputy Director General at the Australian Signals Directorate and head of the Australian Cybersecurity Centre. This all after a long career in both the public and private sectors in cyber. Also with us is Barak Feldman, Senior Vice President, Identity Security at CyberArk, and CyberArk's Regional Director, Australia, New Zealand, Thomas Fikentscher. Let's start this with you, Alastair. My understanding, you joined CyberCX about 18 months ago. It's been quite a tumultuous 18 months. Since then, and you've made enormous progress inside that company, creating what must be the largest Australian cybersecurity company. I wonder if you can just step through, what does the view look like of the of the threat landscape in Australia and the capability to address it, looking at it from where you are now compared to where you were as a National Cybersecurity Advisor?
Well, thanks, James, and lovely to speak to you again. Yeah, look, the view is both different and the same, and it has been a really interesting 18 or so months. Who would have thought that we would be struck with such fascinating sort of economic and social impacts with COVID. But nonetheless, as you said, we've managed to build what is now Australia's largest pure play professional services firm in cybersecurity. What does it look like? I guess things are moving fast, right? We know that cybersecurity is now number 1 or 2, maybe 3 at worst, on any organisation's risk register, public or private. I'm at a client site right now where the board of quite a large company wants to talk about cybersecurity. When I first started in this space, that would have been unheard of. Now it's very regular. What they want to know about is cyber risk, which is really interesting. They know that cybersecurity implies things are binary, you're secure or insecure. When the reality is now most boards, public and private, understand that what they're dealing with is this concept of cyber risk management. How resilient are we to cyber events? And, we recognise that those events, as sad as they are likely to occur. How do we respond to them quickly, reduce harm, et cetera, et cetera? So it's a much more mature conversation than we were having, say, at the launch of Australia's first national cybersecurity strategy in April 2016 with Prime Minister Turnbull. So a lot's happened in those 5 years. A lot's happened in the 18 months. We've seen a massive digital acceleration, as you've said, brought about by COVID, as we've organisations that would have had somewhere on their roadmap to go more digital, to change the way their staff are working, were forced to literally overnight. And we've seen, therefore, this rapid acceleration of digitisation, which is a good thing. That has exposed certain security issues, of course, and organisations continue to try to catch up with that. But if I look more macro, and I'm sorry, I will shut up in a second, it's your first question, and you've only got half an hour for that one, that, we see threat actors emboldened, right, whether they're nation states or criminal groups, and we've not driven cost into them, so the threat environment continues to get worse. We've seen a state of increasing entropy and complexity on what we're trying to protect. So while we've done significant digitisation in a very short time, we've got a lot of legacy systems we're trying to protect. And as that becomes more complex, there's a bigger threat surface for offenders to attack. And the last is that the consequences of failure continued to get worse because we rely more upon connected technologies. So the view is the same but different. I still get on really well with the government folk, and we work closely with them and wish them well in the work that they do, and we see ourselves as helping secure, Australia.
All right, that's a good summary. I'm fascinated at the level of board interest that you now have. I know that was something that people were banging the drum about, quite heavily up until very recently. So that board level interest is quite fascinating. I wanted to go to you, Barak Feldman. We've spoken before, and you've talked about this assumed breach mindset that seems to be growing or quite prevalent these days in corporate America. That was kind of a new term for me. Maybe you can talk it through somewhat and see what you're seeing elsewhere in the world.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I do have to start by agreeing with Alastair that what we're seeing out there is very similar. That the visual that we have when the pandemic hit us back in early 2020. At least in the States, the visual that we had is everyone kind of leaving the office overnight and running home with their workstations, and the IT folks chasing them, right? With, hey, I just need to install one more thing before you go home, and really change the way we're securing our workforce. And I can share with you, even within CyberArk itself, our developments and our R&D, they worked from an office. They were not equipped to work from home, and overnight we had to change our entire philosophy in how we secure our workforce. And to Alastair's point, what happened in many organizations is that a lot of the plans that we had, regardless, to accelerate into cloud and automation, we just accelerated them and did them much faster. So plans that we maybe had for the next 3 to 5 years, we ended up executing in a year as we moved into a different type of environment, a different type of platform, and as technologies were available for us. Amazon, Microsoft, Google have given us technologies that we can allow ourselves to scale. But with that, and now I'll get to your question, James, with that comes, and I love the term, Alastair, of entropy and complexity, because now you have all these services and policies and permissions that are available to us to automate. Well, guess what? Even a medium-sized organization, within a click of a button, can launch massive amount of data, massive amount of systems, and which can, in essence, open the door to attackers. So the assume breach mentality is really one thing that we've learned as we worked with our customers that had security incidents. And when you are post-incident, you're in panic mode, right? You're trying to recover. You're trying to slow down the attacker. You're trying to protect the high risk, the critical infrastructure first, and really, in essence, rebuild your infrastructure. Without, again, the attacker being there. So our approach is, let's already assume that the attacker is in the organization, and while we're still in control, while we still can make decisions and not be under that panic mode of post attack. So once we change that mindset into the attacker is already sitting right now on our workstations waiting for us to do something, we now change our entire philosophy. Our entire philosophy is now all about buying time as the attacker is detected, and make sure the attacker is staying on my workstation and not making their way up into the critical infrastructure. So I'll wrap up with basic things like least privilege. Let's make sure that if they land on my workstation, they only have the least amount of permissions possible, so they can, once again, slow down before they elevate into other systems in the organization and elevate permissions.
So, Alastair, I wanted to ask you on that. I guess that assume breach mindset goes through in a whole organisation. But I wonder, when you're talking to boards, if you're talking about an assumed breach, you'd be terrifying people, wouldn't you? How does that message go down?
I've always given the view to organisations going, a long way back, saying that there's no such thing as a completely secure connected system, right? Even non-connected systems we know aren't completely secure. So it's really talking to them, as I said earlier, about this concept of risk. And the good thing about organisations, public or private, is they get risk. What they haven't completely understood is cyber risk. And once we start getting them talking in traditional risk language, then the concept of an assumed breach, or the concept that an offender is already somewhere in your systems doing something nefarious, is something they get, because it's a bit like work health and safety. You can do as much as you can to reduce the likelihood of staff being hurt at work, but it's making sure you've got systems in place for reporting once a staff member is hurt and how you respond to it and remediate. And that's starting to sound very much to me like a cybersecurity incident. How do I detect when something's gone wrong, have the right systems in place to get it, get that telemetry, the logs and other things I need. To Barak's point, try to have it if the offender is to be sitting in a machine with the least amount of privilege. Let's protect the people who have the most privilege first in an organisation. If we're stepping out, this identity and access controls start with the people with the most access and then work out. And I find organisations, as I said, in the last 5 years, and I've been in this space a long time, as has everyone in this discussion, the type of maturity in those discussions and understanding, not a, oh my goodness, I can't believe it, you're saying that there might be someone already in our systems. It's like, right, can you tell me what it looks like when we discover them? What happens if, for example, they lock up all of our systems, or they're now, as we know, everyone again on this call knows that the traditional ransomware groups are increasingly exfiltrating data and then extorting organisations in exchange for, at least theoretically, not publishing that data. What happens on that day when we get that email? So it's a much more sophisticated discussion, and that means you can have much better roadmap discussions about how to reduce the likelihood, how to be smarter at responding, how to reduce harm to your employees, to your business reputation, to your customers, to your supply chain. And these are all things that matter.
So I don't think there's been any shortage of examples of high-profile ransomware cases that certainly would have boards thinking. Thomas Fikentscher, can I bring you in? From your view, the Australia-New Zealand landscape, what are you seeing in relation to that the level of discussion around cyber?
I like Alastair's term, cyber risk management is a sort of a principal term that is now more and more introduced into the discussions, which is encouraging. But I think it varies by industry. That's what I see. Some of the traditional industries that have been in this space for a longer period of time, like the banking industry in particular, they're more mature, and I think they have a feeling that they have in-house, most of their house in order. But I think what's now happening in that space is the wider ecosystem. So they are really concerned about business connectivity as they open up their systems, their mainframes, their old legacy systems, to accelerate digital transformation and allow people to have a view into the last 10 years of claims management and other systems. They have a really concern about the wider ecosystem and how we actually secure that ecosystem as well. When you go to other industries which might fall under the new critical infrastructure bill, like let's say the food industry or the transport industry, we're going back to the beginning. We're going back to the basics, and I think cyber risk management is something that is probably very new to them, and they need to start from the beginning and create a philosophy of how they actually attack that particular problem. It depends. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, this is a fascinating area, and I'd love to get your views on this, Alastair and Barak. But the pandemic kind of put a spotlight on supply chains. We know that in Australia there's legislation that will kind of broaden the definition of what is critical infrastructure in this country, and that'll include certainly food supply chains, but a much broader set of companies will get captured in that. So are you also seeing that, Alastair, that you're starting from scratch with some of these companies that haven't probably looked at cyber in the same way that the more mature online industries have?
I think Thomas is right. It sounds like we're all agreeing with each other a lot. I particularly like the fact that both Barak and Thomas like my phrases that I'm using. So you guys can come back anytime. So thank you. But I agree with him. Like there's no doubt the banking and finance industry has a much higher degree of maturity. They've spent a lot of money on these things. They tend to have very large, at least the big banks tend to have very large cyber and security organisations. But we know that drops pretty rapidly into when you get into second-tier banking organisations and other financial institutions. And there's no doubt that the level of maturity in other industries is generally lower, and if it's not lower, it's patchy. One of the big fears I have as we move out of that banking and finance space into other parts of the economy is the linkage between our traditional IT and the OT side of things. So for those on the viewing that don't understand the distinction, I'd really refer to the OT side as the industrial machinery bits, the bits that aren't your PCs and your laptops and other things, and the degree of connectivity between those two systems and the lack of understanding in organisations of the criticality of the threat that basically that connected technology can bring in shutting down their operations. And we know that those OT devices were not designed, obviously, with security in mind. They certainly weren't largely designed to be connected up to an internet. Even newer Internet of Things type devices don't really have great security built into them, and yet that's the direction we're heading. You mentioned the concept of 5G and other things. As we move into that world where we want to see our economy increasingly automated, increasingly rely upon real-time decision-making, then that brings it even more to the fore. But you're right, the Securing of Critical Infrastructure Act will bring in, I'm calling it the economy, because once you get those key sectors, which is logical and right, and then you talk about their supply chain, you're pretty much gathering the economy together, and the level of maturity does get pretty thin and patchy at best when you get to that.
Have we got the skills capability right now, Alastair? Do you think we have the sort of pipeline of capability coming through that can seriously plug those holes?
Well, sometimes starting from scratch isn't a bad thing. Sometimes not having to, I'm saying this carefully because we see the consequences when those systems aren't in place, but sometimes starting your cyber sort of risk journey from scratch can be quite healthy because you haven't got vested interests or legacy security things to think about. That's me being glass half full, James, because we all deal all day long with the consequences of failure, and that's kind of our trade. But it does allow us to use smart technologies that are well integrated, combined with the classic people and processes to actually lift quite radically. When I talk to an organisation that has very little sort of cyber risk maturity, I talk to them about needing to understand if they can't see what it is they're trying to protect, if they don't have that visibility of what systems are actually connected to them. There's an awful lot of shadow IT. There's an awful lot of legacy systems that are completely unsupported, that are still connected, and they just don't know it. So get to see that, get that full visibility, understand who has access to it and what access they've got, which gets to that sort of privileged access type of thing and identifying who comes in. It's getting a real-time understanding of what's occurring on those networks, and it's preparing yourself for the fact that bad things are going to happen, and how do we make this part of our normal DNA as organisations. So I'm not a catastrophizer when I talk to these places, but I do urge them to take good action, and that does mean also how they structure themselves internally when it comes to risk. And I'll probably upset half the audience here, but I'm not convinced CISOs or chief security officers in organisations should report into an IT function, because I just don't think that creates the right type of tension, isn't the word, but the right types of balances in an organisation to have a proper risk discussion.
It's an interesting idea, and I'm sure there's some people who will have a look at that. Barak, what do you say? What's going on in the US in terms of where the security function plugs into the overall structure of an organisation?
Yeah, so it's funny, and Alastair, I agree that the change that we're seeing is, as we're moving into more digital transformation and security by design, right, which is something we mentioned, the the security responsibility is moving more and more towards the business, the business that understands the application or the service that they're providing, either a service they're providing their customers, and they need to provide it fast with the best user experience, and it has to be updated on a daily basis and competitive. Or to Alastair's point, we're also seeing a huge trend on the operational technologies, the OT side, where you have manufacturing plants that want to again work faster with more data analytics, with remote access. I don't need to go to the plant anymore, right? I can control it remotely and collect data on how fast I'm manufacturing my product and so on. So what that means is now the ownership is starting to be delegated into the business owners. We like to kind of joke at CyberArk, we call it BISOs instead of CISOs, right? So the business security officer is now someone has to be responsible, the cloud engineering team that is responsible for securing their application that they're producing, which leads to your question, James, and to Alastair's point. We do believe that security now is taking more of a risk responsibility of I'm going to be responsible of the risk to the organization. So think about things that Alastair mentioned, like tabletops and drills, and really educating the organization on awareness and how to prepare for a situation and how do we respond to it. So not just responding technically, even how do we respond to the media and different elements of a security attack. So that's how we feel things are moving. Is security is being delegated more and more to the business, to the developers, to the business, and the traditional security is taken more of a risk role, and that's where we feel this is going towards.
Do you think maybe Thomas, if you want to jump in, this will be accelerated simply by 5G and the proliferation of devices across various networks? Do you think that restructuring of how security is viewed both inside organisations and within the economy will get accelerated at that time also?
Naturally, it has to be accelerated, and I think organizational structure plays a critical role here. I think many organizations looking into where certain functions need to sit and how people need to communicate with each other. I come back to what I said before, the wider ecosystem. I had yesterday a conversation with one of those big banks, and they talked about the wider ecosystem in terms of how that plays into their overall mechanics and how the operating model needs to actually incorporate that wider ecosystem. And then, the technology you mentioned, like 5G and IoT devices that Alastair alluded to, they allow you to provide a broader range of services and a new revenue streams that you create. With that, again, comes a change of ecosystem. That ecosystem needs to change operating models and your organizational structure. So I believe it has to, and everything accelerates right now. So people are driving these revenue opportunities, and they're trying to actually get into new markets. And with that comes obviously exposure to other types of risk and a different way of actually doing business.
So it must be, I'll leave it to you guys to decide who wants to take this one, but it's an incredible time to be in the cyber industry. The amount of spending on IT across all industries is booming. In government, it's booming. In cyber, revenue growth across the industry is continuing to be in rude health. It's even interesting the different threats that are emerging and the geopolitical landscape that we're all facing, and nation state actors, all of these things. I always come away from these discussions feeling slightly downcast because the threat seems to loom so large, but you guys deal with it every day. Where are we in the broadest understanding? Where are we, or is it just it's an ongoing one day after another, dealing with direct issues? Anyone want to have a crack at that long commentary?
I can start, and another element of exciting being in this industry today is not just the interest and awareness, but actually the technologies that are available today that I can, again, all of us have been in the industry for a while. We always dreamt about those technologies being available to us, so we can take action. We're really moving into a more proactive and predictive security, where in the past it was reactive. I got attacked, or I'm gonna, put some firewalls around me, right, and hope that nothing will happen. We're moving into a much more predictive and proactive security, and I'll give you two examples. We're in the industry of password vaulting and privileged access, where I remember 20 years ago, there was a conversation around, passwords are going away. And then 20 years later, we still use our passwords to go in. Well, we're actually in the verge of moving into a passwordless world, where we can use our biometric authentication. We can use location and behavior in order to log in or access different systems, as opposed to relying on a password that is pretty easily compromised. So that's one example. The other example is really moving into a concept of, it's everything as a code is a term that is out there, right? Where I can now make decisions based on changes in the environment. Thomas actually mentioned that in a previous podcast, how there's the massive amount of cloud permissions and interrelationships between different identities and resources out there. It could be very overwhelming, but there's actually an advantage where now I can take a look and make decisions on the fly to say, wait a minute, I gave James X number of permissions. He hasn't used none of them in the last 2 years. Let me automatically take it away. And if he suddenly needs it, maybe I need to, prompt him for something, or do some kind of a workflow. But 99.9% chance you'll either never use it, or you need to use it once. So these are things that are really changing, that are exciting in the industry, that allow us to be a lot more predictive and proactive against the more modern attacks that are out there.
And Alastair, this notion of proactive.
Yeah, look, I agree with Barak. There's an enormous amount of technology out there. You'd expect a professional services guy to say a lot of it's about how one integrates it. There's good kit, there's no doubt. And he's right. I mean, the things that you can do now, that you can provision, at frankly pretty low cost, and following blueprints so that you've sort of got security built in. We used to ship things with password being the password, and manufacturers have got better at doing that and all that. So we're getting better. How we integrate it, how we train our staff to understand that they're all at the front line of protecting the organisation, that DevSecOps type thinking that has been around for a while, but I think is increasingly catching on, which I think was a point that the other folks were making too, that everyone in the organisation has to see themselves as helping secure it. If you're writing code, you've got to try to do it more securely. If you're spinning up cloud instances, you should be doing it using a secure blueprint rather than just leaving some bins open and exposed to the internet. All those things. You talked about the threat environment and whether it's a more depressing place. Look, I would say the threat environment is worse now than it was yesterday. And people that know me well know that I say then, and it's going to be worse tomorrow when you wake up. And the reason why I think it'll be worse tomorrow is because threat actors clearly are emboldened, and we haven't driven cost into them. So we've not increased consequences for bad behaviour, whether it's nation states. If I stick on the nation state side for a while, it tends to be that as a broader political situation gets worse, that you'll see, whichever the state is that you're less politically aligned to or having more problems with, being more active in your systems. That's logical. And so in a world where there's always going to be strife between nations or nations that are striving to better understand why decisions get made and why, what the economy looks like, how political decisions made, etc. in the other economy, that you're always going to see that activity. Criminals are destructive by their nature. They don't care what harm they cause. Most nation states care about causing harm inside systems. They don't want to do that. Whereas criminals build it into their business model. And unfortunately, the internet's been a boon for criminals of all shapes and sizes. And so we're going to see criminals continue to be pretty active. And we haven't even talked about insider threat yet, and the concept of what our own trusted employees can do, and the need for, not a shameless plug for CyberArk, but for any identity and sort of access type of product where what permissions do you give a person? Should my accountant be able to change my HR records or have access to sales data, and vice versa? And all of those things are really important. And these are things that in the past we would have said you don't have a key to that filing cabinet or access to that room in an organisation. And as we spin everything up in the cloud, everything being data, we just need to make sure we've got those right permissions in place, smartly implemented, and we can reduce a lot of the threat surface. And then what we're left with is being really good at understanding, as I said before, about identifying when things are going wrong, minimising the harm, protecting our customers, as in customers of the organisation that's got a problem. We're going to see a lot more issues about supply chain, and you raised that with COVID before. So COVID highlighted physical supply chain issues for us as a nation. And that was a really interesting wake-up call about our industrial base and how much we relied upon things being offshore, and all of those really efficient things that we once thought would never be disrupted. The same goes for our connected devices, and understanding that what an organisation I'm doing business with, either selling to or getting supplied by, how it interacts with my ecosystem, and how that therefore can import risk to me. And we're seeing a lot of organisations that suffer either ransomware or nation-state incidents having to prove to their supply chain that they're not part of a contagion to spread. Give me assurance that all those servers that I traditionally can now just literally hook into you aren't going to spread to my organisation. So it's a really different way we respond to incidents than even a handful of years ago. But look, I'm a glass half full guy. Yes, it's a good industry to be in, there's no doubt, but I do think we'll make progress to actually reducing cyber risk and having it as just built into the DNA of organisations, such that people like us hopefully are sort of written out of jobs, and it's just part of the normal way an organisation does business.
All right, Aleister McGibbon, thank you. That's a good summary of the challenges and opportunities. Aleister McGibbon from CyberCX, Barak Feldman from CyberArk, and Thomas Fikentscher. I'm going to leave the end to you. We've journeyed through that word journey through 8 episodes of this series that we've been doing. I wonder, we've talked about education, we've talked about, obviously privileged access management, inside the perimeter, and skills and capabilities, and all of these things. I'm going to give you a chance to round up and just really say the challenges that we face today and the opportunities that we can look forward to today and tomorrow.
My glass is also half full. I'm not pessimistic. I'm very optimistic. I think there's multiple trend lines that are coming together in a good way. Yes, there are more cyber incidents, and I think that's painful. But at the same time, it actually wakes people up and it focuses your mind on a very, very important topic. And that's not just happening in IT. It's actually now reverberating through the business functions into the boardroom. And I think that's very, very important, because it actually, all of a sudden, people start to get things done. At the same time, you have a change in the regulatory environment. I think there's discussions of the Privacy Act and what that means, GDPR discussions, how that could actually come into Australia. There is certainly a more collaboration between universities and the private sector to figure out where the pipeline of talent is going to come from. There is new technologies being introduced, but these introduced with a little bit of awareness that they could also cause harm if we don't put security around that. So there are multiple trend lines coming together, and I think that's actually healthy. It's going to be pretty disruptive, especially for new industries who haven't done much in that space. Quite disruptive, but I think they can learn from other organizations who are a little bit more advanced. And from my perspective, it's all a really good environment to be working in. And as long as we have a view of all the different elements of cybersecurity, not just technology is going to fix it for us, I think we're gonna create some really, really good outcomes, and it will be better. will not be perfect, I think, anytime soon, but I think we're going to have a lot better outcomes and more secure environments that we operate in.
All right, we'll draw a line under it there. Thank you very much for a great discussion, Thomas Fikentscher and Barak Feldman from CyberArk and Aleister McGibbon from CyberCX. Well, thank you for coming on. We'll see you again.